Hey everyone, how's it going? My name is Matt Jarbo. Today is the last day of Star Wars Celebration for 2 years. And as we come into the last film in this final trilogy of the Skywalker Saga, more and more things come to light, specifically through interviews with someone like, well, Kathleen Kennedy. And if you're unfamiliar with Kathleen Kennedy, let me fill you in. This is Kathleen Kennedy with Daisy Ridley at Star Wars Celebration, having a grand old time, right? They're laughing, they're joking, they're playing around, and they're enjoying basking in the fan spotlight that's been thrust upon them. But Kennedy herself is quite literally one of the most powerful women in Hollywood. She was handpicked by George Lucas to head up Lucasfilm following the buyout by Disney and Bob Iger back in 2012. She's been with them now for over 6 years, just recently signed to another 3-year contract to run Lucasfilm and therefore the Star Wars brand. And she is, I think, very much ready for this chapter in Star Wars history to be over with because of how bungled it's gotten. And it's true. By her own admission, they don't really have much of a plan, but we're gonna get to that. First things first, the final trilogy is almost upon us. And looking here at the posters, we can see that something is amiss. Something's a little bit off kilter. Something's a little bit off center. And of course, that's pretty reflective of this trilogy of Star Wars films themselves, isn't it? Isn't that just a perfect description of everything that's happened with this franchise since Disney took over back in 2012? And the thing is, I'm not hating on Disney or Kathleen Kennedy. There are just facts here that the franchise has had a lot of problems. And a lot of that has to do with the management of the series, the management of the franchise, the management of this final trilogy. And that does boil down to, well, Kathleen Kennedy, who is the person who is, well, responsible for it all. That smile and that thumb to Daisy Ridley right here is the woman who's in charge of it all. And here's the deal. We want her to have fun. We want her to be enjoying herself because we also want to enjoy ourselves with this particular franchise. And one of the things that came out of it, alongside the announcement of the final trilogy, was all of these Star Wars anthology films. In fact, looking over here on the Star Wars fandom site, we can see here that the anthology series was originally announced at Celebration in Anaheim in 2015. That was 4 years ago in 4 days was when Rogue One was announced, followed up by the announcement of Solo, a Star Wars story, and then an untitled Star Wars film, which was going to be coming in 2020. That one we believed at the time was ultimately I believe the Boba Fett film, or possibly the Obi-Wan film that were rumored to be in development. There were all of these things happening at the time. There were all of these things happening around that moment, and everyone was gearing up for Force Awakens to come out, and they were getting excited about the future with The Last Jedi. And then, of course, The Last Jedi came and basically broke everything. It did. There's no other quantifying factor to describe the fandom menace outside of The Last Jedi absolutely breaking canon in a number of ways, subverting expectation in other ways, and ultimately making just the franchise and the fandom this massive battlefield that never needed to be there. It never needed to be where it was, but there was a number of factors that went into it. You had Rian Johnson kind of criticizing the fans that were criticizing his work. He was trolling them. There were comments Kathleen Kennedy made about the fan base. There were comments other Lucasfilm employees made about the fan base, and that is one of the reasons why people like those who believe in the fandom menace have been able to gain a relatively decent foothold inside of the fandom. And it's not to say that they are vastly influential, but their reach does have legs. And well, Solo's failure is one of the reasons that ultimately they kind of declared it a victory. But all of that would have been avoided. All of that would have been avoided if there would have been some kind of cohesive plan going into this trilogy, right? You figure Lucas created the prequel trilogy, knowing where it was going to end, knowing what he wanted to do. And when Disney bought Lucasfilm back in 2012. They tossed all of Lucas's ideas out the window, and he himself has admitted that. JJ Abrams and Lawrence Kasdan went back in and tried to pull a little bit from the EU as a way to appease some fans, but it was still a bit of a pain in the ass, and they didn't do that good of a job. Solo was a movie that everyone claims nobody asked for, but still it was one that I liked, and I think a lot of people ended up liking it after the fact, but it was bogged down by the problems that came out of The Last Jedi. And another thing that even stemmed from that was the whole situation involving JJ Abrams coming back in the fall of 2017 before the release of The Last Jedi, with him coming to take over episode 9 simply because, well, Colin Trevorrow had quit. And then this article here, even JJ Abrams is having to respond to Rian Johnson's The Last Jedi. And if you don't believe me, and I've covered this before, he says here that to have no script and to have a release date that is essentially a 2-year window where you're saying to yourself, you've got 2 years from the decision to do it release. You have literally nothing. And then even scrolling down here, he says, without getting into the weeds on episode 8, there was a story that Ryan wrote and was telling based on episode 7 before we met. So he was taking the thing in another direction. Now, what does that tell you? Well, it tells you, for one, that JJ Abrams knew that The Last Jedi was absolutely going to be doing away with his vision. Daisy Ridley confirmed way back in the day that, or at least right around, I think a little after the release maybe of The Last Jedi, where JJ Abrams had written an outline for episodes 8 and 9, and Rian Johnson completely bucked the system on that one, and ultimately even went his own way with Kathleen Kennedy's blessing, because she allowed it to happen. Now that we're coming into the end stage of this trilogy, with there being just over 8 months to go until its release, or 9 months to, I don't even know what month it is anymore, but it's coming in a few months. We've seen the teaser trailer. Then the question then becomes, well, what happens next? Well, I already covered that in this video titled The Next 10 Years, where Kathleen Kennedy does talk about what she wants to do with the franchise. And with the franchise, she ultimately wants to take it to David Weiss and DB Weiss and David Benioff from Game of Thrones, and then also Rian Johnson to talk about where she wants to go next. But in an interview with Entertainment Weekly, we got a bit more insight here, saying that she's talking about the future of the franchise and talking with Entertainment Weekly about where she wants to go next. And that idea centers around the concept of exploring different time periods, saying, yes, absolutely, I think that was on the horizon. We're looking at whether we can move massively in one direction or another. It's still Star Wars, and holding on to the DNA of what George created is still very important to us. I think this is a huge opportunity to step into the galaxy in a bit different part of the timeline. So what that basically tells you is that through all the last 6 years, right, all the last 6 years of talking about these movies and working on these movies, they've had no plan. They've had no plan. We know this from JJ Abrams talking about Rian Johnson's The Last Jedi. We know Kathleen Kennedy greenlit that movie. We know that she has protected Rian Johnson. We know that she wants to work with him still to develop a trilogy, by her own admission just the other day. But she also sits here and says that we don't know where we're going to go next. Maybe we're going to explore a different time period, which, hey, listen, that's fine. If you want to explore a different time period, no one is going to fault you. There was the rumor that D.B. Weiss and David Benioff are interested in the Old Republic. And if they can give us a KOTOR film, by all means, they would make a lot of money. That would be a very good sign of good faith towards fans that feel like this franchise has gotten away from them. And the way I personally look at it here is that it's very irresponsible to run a multi-billion-dollar company that puts out films that do gross multi-billions of dollars and to not have a solid plan going into it. If I were to write a novel, I would outline it first, the beginning, the middle, and the end. The 3-act structure is how we generally tend to see movies, even though ultimately it does kind of boil down to maybe a 4 or 5-act structure, depending on the writer you talk to. But still, you outline what you want to do. You set your intention. You write down your goals. You bullet point that stuff. Here, everything took a different turn. Here, everything went the opposite direction, which is one of the things I find to be very odd, that someone like Bob Iger, who seems like he is very much about control and very much about knowing what his franchises are doing and making sure that they're on the right track in order to continuously earn Disney billions of dollars. This also coming around the same time they're getting ready to unleash Star Wars Galaxy's Edge, which is $1 billion park. By $1 billion, I mean $1 billion per park for Disneyland and Disney World. So you figure at this point in time that they would have a clear plan for where they want to go next. And obviously they didn't. They didn't. The Boba Fett movie is pretty much done. The Obi-Wan movie may happen in regards to being a Disney Plus series, which would be fine. Ewan McGregor is not above doing television with Fargo. So we know that those could be a reality. And Disney Plus is where Star Wars is going to go for a while in order to essentially reestablish trust with the fan base. The Mandalorian looked amazing from the footage that leaked out of Star Wars Celebration yesterday. And I think they know that, and that's where they want to go. Besides, doing an 8-episode season that costs, $80 million or $100 million is far cheaper than spending the money on a big budget movie that's going to require all the print and advertising. They can make all of that money back and a lot more by getting people enticed to spend $7 a month or $70 for the year on Disney Plus. This is where Star Wars is going to go. And I don't think that's by Kathleen Kennedy's own design. I think Bob Iger went to them and said, we're doing this, give me something I can use. And then she went to Favreau or talked to Favreau and Filoni, and they pitched her the idea for The Mandalorian and maybe other shows, and she went with that. But as far as feature film, it's clear that she has no plan. It's clear that even after she signed on for 3 more years and she's trying to establish the next 10 years, she still has no plan. I don't get that. There was no plan for this trilogy, and there's no plan for after this trilogy. I think personally, my take on it is that she was hoping that Rogue One and Solo were going to do so well that they could just do standalone stories for a couple years in hopes of getting around the fact that they had no plan. But by her own words, by her own admission, by JJ Abrams' own words and by his own admission, we are now seeing the pieces of this larger puzzle that really do give us a vision into fact that, well, Lucasfilm doesn't know what the hell it's doing. And I'm not going to sit there and say Kathleen Kennedy should be fired. People do want her gone. And I think they've got good reason to say that. But I want her to look at where things are and to realize that as far as the person who runs the ship, the captain of this multi-billion-dollar franchise, she has just let it go unchecked. How do you walk into this and not have a plan? That's what I don't get. And that's why I find her comments to be very revealing and why I wanted to share them with you. Anyway, what are your thoughts about this? Do you think that they ever had a plan? Do you think they ever will have a plan? Do you think Star Wars will ever find itself back in the good graces of all film goers rather than just a select few? Do you think episode 9 is going to actually be a hit? I mean, I'm curious to know your thoughts. Let me know down in the comments below. If you guys haven't already, please thumbs up the video, subscribe. I'll talk to you all later. Have yourself a great day, and peace out.